The deed was recorded on the 14th of November, 1887, in Harlan County, and it gave Clement Briggs the White House, the kitchen garden, the smokehouse, the well, and every acre of timber ground his father had left him. It gave his wife, Nora, the barn. She stood on the frozen clay yard between the two buildings and read the document twice in the gray morning light because she thought she had misread it the first time. She had not. The barn. 22 feet by 40, board and batten siding, a rusted tin roof with 3 gaps where the weather came through, a haymow above and a dirt floor below. No hearth, no pump, no glass in the loft window, only a square of cold sky the size of a crate lid. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket and didn't look at the house again, because Clement was watching from the porch with his arms folded, and she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her turn back toward it. She walked to the barn, pulled the south door open against its swollen lower hinge, and stepped inside. Cress, the shepherd dog her father had given her the year before his lungs gave out, came in at her heel without being asked. The mule Burl lifted his head from the manger and regarded her with the steady, incurious warmth that mules extend to people they have decided to tolerate. The barn smelled of hay and cold clay, and the mineral damp that earth floors give off when the temperature falls below 20 degrees. She stood in the middle of it and breathed, and the breath came back visible, and she breathed again. I did not understand, that morning, what the barn was going to become. I did not understand that the thing Clement thought he was taking from me was the very thing I was going to need, or that the knowledge my father left me, all those winters in Letcher County, on his ridge above Whitesburg, was about to find the work it had been waiting for. I knew only the cold and the folded paper in my pocket and the weight of what I had lost. I did not yet know that the barn was sitting with its back against a hillside that had been holding the previous summer in its limestone body since September. I did not yet know that the thing he had handed me as a punishment was the best-sited structure on the property. What I did not yet know could have filled the whole hollow. There were people who saw me walk out of that house, or heard it from the ones who did, which in that part of Harlan County amounted to the same thing and often produced a fuller account. Before the week was gone, the word had traveled to Clover Fork and back, and the word was simple. Nora Briggs was living in the barn. Not that Clement had put her there. Living in the barn, as though it had been her own peculiarity. The word moved through the hollow the way embarrassing news moves, quickly and with a headshake attached. On the porch at Tatum's store, they said it in the tone that holds a woman's misfortune at a safe distance, close enough to discuss and far enough not to be obligated by. Dovie Kelkins said it while smoothing her skirt and examining the ceiling. Harlan Tatum, who ran the store and the Post and weighed in on every subject of local consequence for 30 years, said she ought to go to her sisters in Evarts and not be foolish. He said it was a shame. The word shame in his mouth carried the weight of a man who believed that shame and cold weather were both things that happened to people who had not prepared adequately. I was 31 years old. I had $12, a mule named Burl, a shepherd dog named Cress, and the barn. I had, in the tin box I had carried out under one arm while the papers were being signed, my father's notebook, 40 pages of his close, small handwriting, covering everything he had learned over 40 years of building in mountain hollows, where the cold came from 2 directions and a fire that went out at 2 in the morning was a matter of surviving until daylight. He had called it his thinking book, though it was less thinking than recording, less theory than the accumulated practice of a man who had gotten things wrong enough times, in enough specific ways, to have become careful, and then to have written the carefulness down. He had pressed it into my hands the winter I was 19, the first winter after my mother passed, when the two of us were alone on the ridge and learning to manage without her. He held the book out without ceremony and said, "The land will teach you if you will let it, but this will keep you from having to relearn what killed the others." Then he went back to his work at the stove, and we had not spoken of it again. But I had read it that night and kept it from that point forward alongside my mother's 2 letters and the small brass button my father had sent from the war when I was 5, among the things that were not replaceable. He was gone by the time Clement served the papers. My father, Gideon Adkins, had died in February of 1885 in his sleep and without apparent suffering, which was the death he had asked for and been given. I had grieved him the way you grieve a person who was your primary teacher, which carries not only the grief of loss, but the grief of recognizing that all the questions you forgot to ask are now permanently unanswerable. I kept his lessons in the place where they had always lived, which was in my hands and in the particular way I had learned to read cold, not by instinct but by long watching of the same conditions over many winters until the patterns became plain. He had been a man who built things to last without being asked to, who put the extra course of stone at a wall's base not because the county required it, but because the ground asked for it if you listened. He knew how heat moved through a building the way rivermen know how water moves through a channel, from observation and from the respect that comes from having miscalculated. That knowing was the only inheritance he had to leave, and it was the kind the court could not weigh. The barn had a south-facing slope below it, open and receiving whatever thin winter sun appeared in that narrow valley. Behind the north wall the hill rose, packed earth and limestone shelf running at a depth I estimated, from the way the frost lines behaved in the yard, at about 4 feet below the surface. That hill's mass meant the north wall was backed by several thousand tons of earth and stone that had been absorbing the previous summer's warmth since May and releasing it slowly since October, a long and patient underground resistance to the cold that no amount of fired wood could replicate, but that a well-sited building could borrow. My father had called this thermal patience. He meant it as plain description. The earth is patient with its warmth in a way the air is not, he had written. And a wall that leans into a hillside leans into all the summer that hillside has carried forward. On the second morning, I knelt in the dirt and pressed my palm flat to the floor and timed the cold by sensation, as he had taught me. And what came up was not the snap cold of frozen ground, but the slow, deep chill of earth that had not yet entirely let go of the season before this one. That was the thing Clement had not understood when he gave me this structure as a dismissal. The hill at its back was a quiet engine. I stood up and went to get the shovel. I began the outside work in the first week of December, and what it looked like from the road above was digging. And digging in December in Harlan County looked like grief or madness. So that is what it was reported as. I was opening the south face of the hill 6 feet back from the barn's north wall, cutting 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide at a careful uphill angle, packing the displaced earth against the lower side, and letting the exposed limestone face of the cut receive what sun appeared and hold it as stone holds things, densely and without advertisement. This was the sod gallery my father had described in the notebook, learned from a Cornish miner in the Virginia hills who had never owned a stove and whose house was the warmest in his county, and for which his neighbors had never found a satisfactory explanation. The gallery traps the sun's warmth in the stone face and releases it back through the north wall during the cold hours, without fire and without anyone needing to be awake to tend it. It does not make a room warm the way a stoked fire does, with immediate consuming heat that burns through wood and leaves ash. It makes it warm the way the earth makes things warm, by accumulation and patience and the long memory of stone. "She is digging a burrow," said Dovie Calkins at the church social on the second Sunday of December. and the women received this with the murmuring appropriate to news that is both distressing and satisfying, as confirmation of what was already suspected. Harlan Tatum, who had stopped his wagon on the road above twice to look down at my work, told the men at the store on the Saturday before Christmas that he had not thought Gideon Atkins's girl had gone that far to pieces, saying it with the expression of a man who had hoped otherwise and been disappointed. He said it looked like a root cellar. His brother, Walt, down from Virginia and delayed past Christmas by ice in the Gap, said he had seen a similar arrangement built by a man in the upper hollows of Wise County, who had survived 2 winters in it before the structure failed, which Walt apparently offered as something I might find encouraging. Walt Tatum had a long, weathered face and the patience of a man who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it, and he said it without malice, as a simple accounting of outcomes. I continued. Inside the barn, I laid the warming floor through the 2nd and 3rd weeks of December. Flat creek stones carried in grain sacks over 3 long days, laid in a broad arc along the north wall, mortared with red clay and fine-cut straw, set in a grade that rose toward the north wall at a pitch my father had specified as roughly the width of 2 fingers over the length of the room. Cold air sinks and pools, he had written, and pools of cold air are the death of a room's warmth, because they settle at floor level and refuse to move. A grade that rises gently toward the coldest wall coaxes the cold air up along the stone, where the warming floor's mass heats it from below, and the slow movement distributes the warmth evenly, rather than concentrating it near the ceiling and abandoning the floor. I had watched him lay the same floor in the cellar of his ridge house when I was 9 years old, not understanding what I was watching at the time, understanding it fully only now with my own hands in the cold clay, and his notebook open on the barrel beside me when I needed to check the proportions. On the 3rd day of laying, I ran a thin trickle of water across the finished surface and watched it move slowly toward the north wall. And when it moved, I sat back on my heels and breathed out. The loft window I fitted with 2 layers of oiled muslin on cedar frames. I had cut and pegged myself. The inner layer hung an inch from the outer on a thin cedar rail, so that the dead air between them would act as its own insulation. My father had written about this principle with the simplicity he reserved for things he was most certain of. Dead air is your friend in cold. He had underlined it, which he did rarely. The still air trapped between the 2 layers was not heated, only stopped, and its stillness was worth more than its temperature. Cress sat behind my left heel through all of it, as she always did when I was still for more than a few minutes, as though she had taken up that post as her permanent station and never reconsidered. She was gray and tan, medium built, with the long, patient intelligence that good working dogs develop when they have been through difficulty with a person they trust. Burl observed the construction from his end of the barn with mild, unyielding composure. On the evening of Christmas Eve, I set the stove to a steady middle pace and took the interior reading before I lay down. 41 degrees inside, 19 outside. 22 degrees of difference without pushing the fire past what a careful woman feeds a stove when she is making the wood last. I wrote the numbers in the notebook's back pages below my father's handwriting. Then I blew out the lamp and lay down, and Cress came to my feet and I slept warm. If you have stayed this long, you know what kind of story this is, and what it is moving toward. If you want to know whether the work held when the cold that old-timers would still be describing 30 years on came down off the plateau, stay close. The number is in the telling. Clement moved Ruth Calder into the White House in the 2nd week of January. He had been keeping company with her since September, which the county had known, and I had also known, and which I had chosen to leave where it lay. He walked her past the barn on their first morning, and I didn't look up from the wood I was splitting at the block. He did not speak. She glanced at the barn and looked away. They went on to the house. That was the last time I saw either of them until the storm. January opened hard, but not yet remarkable. I slept warm and kept the stove at my father's honest pace, meaning the middle pace, the one that neither burns tomorrow's wood today, nor makes promises to the cold it cannot keep. The warming floor and the hill's mass made the honest pace sufficient, which is precisely what they were designed to do. By the 17th, the thermometer at Tatum's store read 8 degrees at midday. Tatum told the men on his porch it was as cold as he could recall for a January midday in 30 years. They were wearing coats, but they were not suffering. This was the last day that comfortable could be said of any building on the road. The night of January the 21st, the cold came in earnest. It came from the northwest, off the plateau, and through the gap in a front that arrived first as a change in the wind's character. Something more purposeful in it than ordinary cold, more deliberately cold, as though the temperature had stopped being a condition of the air and had become a direction of intent. I felt it when I stepped out at bedtime to check Burl's water, and came back in and stoked the stove and checked the muslin frames and seated the south door tight in its leather surround, and sat for a while with the thermometer before I lay down. It read 43 degrees. Outside it was 14. By the morning of the 22nd, it was 12 below at Tatum's store. By the 23rd, it was 17 below. The creek had iced from bank to bank for the first time in living memory on the road. The snow that fell with the cold was the fine, dry kind the mountain people call bitter snow. So fine it does not pack, but accumulates like flour against any seam or gap it finds, working into door frames and window sills with a patience equal to its temperature. A door left unattended for 6 hours could be sealed in its frame by morning. Inside the barn on the 23rd, my thermometer read 38 degrees. No wind had found the sod gallery or the packed banking. The muslin in the loft window showed condensation on the outer layer, and nothing on the inner, exactly as my father's notebook said it would if the principle was correctly applied. 38 degrees with the stove banked since midnight. Burl stood quietly. Cress had not stirred. The hens in the mow were laying. Down the road, the picture was different on every side. Harlan Tatum's store had a burst pipe in the back room by the second morning. The family who had taken the Dunbar place, a couple named Vane who had come from Ohio that fall, had built a clean pine frame house the Hollow admired all autumn for its planned lumber and white trim. But pine contracts in dry December, cold and opens hairlines in the frame joints, and the bitter snow finds those hairlines and packs them and the cold flows through. The Vanes burned through 3 cords in 2 days, and their floor near the east wall was still cold enough to freeze water in a pan. They lost 2 hogs to the cold in the outbuilding, and their eldest child ran a frightening fever for 2 days. Brought through safely by the Tanner family, 3 miles up the road where the log walls had been settling for 30 years and were about as airtight as hand-cut timber gets. 3 households on the road had fires running at a rate their woodpiles could not sustain past the 5th day. An elderly man living alone was found on the 24th by a neighbor who broke the door, alive, sitting beside a cold stove with a quilt over his head, his wood having run out in the night. 17 below outside. 38 inside with a banked stove. Those were my father's numbers, borrowed from a hillside and a stone ark, and 20 years of understanding that had lived in my hands since he first pressed them to a wall and asked me to feel the difference between cold and still. Ruth Calder came to the south door on the morning of the 24th. She knocked, which was correct given what stood between us, and I heard it through the heavy door and opened it. The warmth rolled out past her in a visible current, meeting the 17 below air at the threshold, and showing itself plainly as warmth always does in extreme cold. She stood in the yard, in everything she owned, layered over itself until her silhouette was nearly square, and her face above the shawl at her throat was raw with the rawness that is one step before worse. She looked past me into the interior and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He told me it was not worth more than a shed." I opened the door wider and stepped back. She came in with her quilt and sat on the milking stool near the south wall and held her hands near the stove in the careful way of a person who knows not to move too fast toward warmth. Cress went to her once and accepted a hand on her head and returned to my heel. Burl regarded Ruth Calder from his end of the barn with the same patient, uncommitted attention he extended to everything that was not hay. By the afternoon of the 24th, Mabel Vane had come with her husband and their 2 younger children. 2 men from the upper road knocked and were let in. By dark, there were 9 people in the barn, arranged on quilts and grain sacks along the walls, and the stove burned steady and the floor worked, and the thermometer held between 36 and 39. On the morning of the 25th, Harlan Tatum came himself. He walked down from the store through the drifted snow with his hat pulled low, moving with the pace of a man who has a specific errand and is not entirely sure how he feels about it. I heard his boots on the stone threshold. I opened the south door. The warmth went past me in that rolling, unmistakable current, and he felt it full in the face and was still. He stepped inside. He stood and looked at the stone arc along the north wall and the packed earth banking behind it, the people along the walls, the stove at its steady pace. He turned and read the thermometer on the post. He looked at it longer than he needed to read it. Then he turned back. "She built warmer than the house," he said. It came out of him the way a fact comes out of a person who has been carrying a contradiction for weeks and has finally run out of room for it, without preamble and without apology. He held his hat in his hands. "I told him my father had taught me," I said in 2 level sentences drawn from my father's principle, "that the earth holds summer all winter long if you ask it to, and that stone does not forget warmth, and that a building laid right with a hillside at its back will outlast the wood in any ordinary man's shed." The room was illustrating my words better than my words could illustrate themselves. He nodded once, not the nod of a man agreeing, but of a man deciding to stop doubting. Then he asked if there was room for 3 more, because Walt Tatum and the Calkins boy were at the store with nowhere warm to go. There was room. Walt Tatum came in and took his place along the east wall and sat quietly until the warmth reached him and he took his coat off and folded it in his lap. He did not speak much, but he looked at the floor and the banking and the window frame with the careful, inventorying eyes of a man who is not simply staying warm, but is studying the reason he is staying warm. When he left 2 days later, he paused at the south door and looked back at the stone arc and nodded to himself once, the same private nod his brother had made, and went out into the clearing cold. By the morning of the 25th, there were 14 people in the barn, along with Burl and Cress and the hens. The stove burned at the honest pace. The thermometer, which I checked at dawn and at midday and at dark, recorded a low of 34 and a high of 41 across the 5 days of the deep cold. Outside, the low at Tatum's store reached 21 below on the night of the 26th and did not rise above 0 until the 29th. No one perished in that barn. The county records compiled that spring noted 17 deaths across Harlan County in the 9 days of the extraordinary cold of January 1888. The Vane family's 2 hogs were gone until spring. 2 households on the upper road came through with water damage and ruined stores, and did not fully recover their footing until the following autumn. These were not foolish or careless people. They were people whose buildings had been built the way buildings had always been built in that country, and the cold that came that January was a cold that the old way of building had not been asked to survive before, and could not survive now. 14 people, and a mule and a dog in a barn dismissed as a shed, in a cold that killed 17. Harlan Tatum did not apologize, and I did not require one. What he did, beginning in early spring, was something more useful. He came to the barn 3 times before the snow was fully gone, and each time he brought Petros Keel, who wrote for the paper in Pineville, and who had been making notes about the method since January. Between Tatum's knowledge of the local building habits and Keel's careful questions and my explanations drawn from the notebook and the winter's numbers, they assembled a clear account of the warming floor and the sod gallery and the hillside siding principle and the stone arc and all the particulars that, taken together, produced what the thermometer had recorded. Keel's article ran in March and called the method earthkeeping, which was not the term my father had used but was not wrong. The piece gave my father's name in the 3rd paragraph and mine in the 4th, and stated that the knowledge had come from a man who had learned it from a Cornish miner 40 years before, and had passed it to a daughter who had applied it in conditions that left no room for argument about whether it worked. 6 homesteads in the hollow incorporated some portion of the method before the next winter. 3 did it fully, with the stone arc and the careful grade and the sod gallery cut at the right angle to the hill. 2 copied the visible form without the underlying principle, banking walls without laying the arc or establishing the grade. And those 2 were warmer but not dramatically so, which is what always happens when form travels without the understanding that gives form its purpose. The one who understood it most completely was Mabel Vane. Mabel Vane had sat in the barn for 2 full days in January, watching the thermometer readings and the stove's unhurried pace and feeling the floor under her boot soles in the early hours before the fire came up, when the floor's own stored warmth was all there was. She was a person who learns from what she observes. She had also, I found out later, borrowed the notebook 2 evenings while her family slept and had copied the measurements and the grade formula and the clay mortar proportions into the back of her own household account book. She rebuilt her family's pine frame house that summer with an earth floor and a full stone arc along the north wall, and she chinked the frame joints with the clay and horsehair compound my father described on page 11, and she told her daughters why each step was what it was, not once but until they understood the principle rather than merely the practice. The following January, her household burned half what they had burned the winter before and was comfortable at floor level throughout. She had taken the inheritance in the right hand, which is the hand that knows the reason for the work and not just the work. I stayed in the barn through that winter and the 2 after, and what had been a structure a man gave his wife to be rid of her became, by gradual stages, a house in the full sense. Warmer than most of the frame buildings on the road and cheaper to heat by half. I framed out 2 rooms in the lower half with boards cut from the timber at the south edge of the property, using the barn's existing walls as the outer shell and adding only what the space required. By the spring of 1890, the structure that Clement had written off as a shed had become the thing he had intended as a punishment and had accomplished instead. Clement sold the White House to a family from Bell County in the fall of 1890. I did not see him after. I did not mourn the parting. I had the stone and the earth and the hill at my back and the notebook in its tin box. And I had begun to add to my father's pages, writing my own winter readings in the back in the column I had started in December of 1887. Adding my own observations the way a root adds itself below a tree already standing. Cress lived to 12 years, which is a long life for a working dog in mountain country. She is in every winter I can call back clearly from those years, at my heel during work and on the warming floor in the late afternoon, when a bar of light came through the muslin window at a low angle and made a warm patch on the stone that she found and lay in with a precise and unabashed satisfaction. She is in the January of the cold, breathing slowly against my feet while 14 people slept along the walls, indifferent to the 17 below and to everything that was happening in buildings she had no knowledge of, because the floor was warm and I was near, and those were the only conditions she required. Burl worked until his 21st year and was sound throughout. When he was gone, I felt his absence the way you feel the absence of a steady and uncomplaining companion, the particular quiet of a space that has always been occupied and is simply empty now. Petros Keel's article found its way to a college in Lexington, and in the winter of 1891, a man from that college came with a measuring rod and written questions. He measured everything twice and left with notes that became a pamphlet sent to county extension agents in 3 states, recommending the method for highland homestead construction in regions of deep winter cold. My father's name did not appear in that edition. Mine appeared in a footnote. The principle appeared throughout, more or less intact, which is the part that matters. By the late 1890s, the method had been set down in 3 publications, each partial and each losing in transmission, the things that are always lost when knowledge moves from hands to paper and back to hands again. The things that could be stated as measurements survived. The things that could only be felt in the cold hours before a fire was up. The quality of warmth that has been stored rather than generated. Those traveled only through people who had stood in a warm room in a cold January and understood that the warmth was coming from the floor as much as from the stove, and who had asked the right question about why. My father had understood this. It was why he had written at the top of the notebook's first page, in his forward-leaning hand, "This is a record of what I learned by being wrong first." He had known the useful knowledge lived in the hands, and that the page was only a vessel for carrying it until the hands that needed it were ready. Mabel Vane's granddaughter Clara came to me in the autumn of 1901, 17 years old and direct, and asked what the marks on the stone ark meant, because her grandmother had told her there was meaning in them, and she wanted to know it. I told her. She sat on the milking stool where Ruth Calder had sat in the cold morning of January 1888 and listened with the attentiveness of a person storing what she heard in the place where principles live rather than the place where facts are kept. I answered her questions for 2 hours. When she rose to go, I took the notebook from the tin box and held it out, and she took it in both hands and looked at my father's name written inside the cover and was careful with it in a way that said she understood what she was holding. I told her it was hers to keep. She said she would add to it when she had something worth adding. I told her that was exactly right. There is a stretch of Harlan County where the hillside barns sit lower and closer to the ground than they used to, where south doors are cut wide and north walls banked against the slope, and a number of the floors have stone arcs along the cold walls rather than bare packed earth. Not all of them, not even most, but enough that a person coming from elsewhere and walking that hollow in January might notice that some of the smoke from those chimneys is lighter and more patient than the cold ought to allow, as though the buildings it comes from are not working quite as hard as buildings in that temperature are supposed to work. The earth-keeping barns, a few older people still call them, though most of the younger ones have forgotten the term and simply know those buildings as warm, the way you know a road is good, when you have traveled it in all weather and it has always held. Clara teaches school in a valley 12 miles from the hollow. She has her grandmother's attentiveness and the notebook, all 40 pages of my father's writing, plus the back pages where I kept the winter column from 1887 onward. The dated readings in 2 columns outside and inside. The fuel records, the notes on what the clay mortar did in a wet season, and what the stone ark did in a drought year, when the ground dried past a certain depth and lost some of its patience. She understands the notebook the way my father would have wanted, not as a set of instructions, but as a record of a principle at work across many conditions, a record that can be read forward and extended rather than simply repeated. She told me the last time she came to visit that she had added 6 pages of her own in the 2 years since I gave it to her. I told her to keep going. She will. The barn stands. The sod gallery was rebuilt once and weathered, and eventually the hill grew into the banking over the decades, roots working into the packed earth and making the whole mass more solid, as roots do when they are given good reason to hold. The stone ark along the north wall is unchanged from the December I laid it, the Flat Creek stones still seated in their red clay mortar, still running their patient grade toward the north wall, still doing what a warming floor does, which is to ask the earth to be a partner in the long work of keeping people through January. In the coldest hours, before first light, when the fire has been banked for 6 hours and the night has done its worst, the floor is still warmer than the air above it. That is what my father promised. That is what it has kept. In January, the cold comes down the mountain the same way it always has, without opinion and without apology, off the plateau and through the gap and into the hollow where the buildings wait for it. In the buildings that were sited right and laid right, given the hill's patience and the stone's memory, it finds the same answer it has always found, which is warmth held in stone from a season past, warmth that costs nothing to give in January because it was stored in September, warmth that asks only to be asked for. Some knowledge lives in books, some lives in hands. The kind that lasts is the kind that knows the difference and passes itself forward and does not wait to be proved right before it does its work.